In studying naval history, you often come across stories of ships surviving extreme damage. USS Laffey, for example. Or for my own favorite story, HMS Javelin, a ship that lost her bow and stern at the same time. These are the more famous ships. Today's video, however, will look at a lesser known one, a British escort carrier that was torpedoed in the stern and very nearly sank. Her stern went down no less than 15 feet, 4.6 meters, before the crew got the flooding under control. Despite being so far down by the stern, the ship remained afloat and capable of operating aircraft. Not to mention, through a Herculean effort, her crew sailed the ship home under her own power. That carrier was HMS Nabob, and not only did she survive that damage, but the ship would last surprisingly long. Considering her wartime service, that's nothing to sneeze at. That said, that service was on the shorter end, only about a year. So this video will also, as a result, be a bit on the shorter side. Also, before I move on, I'm admittedly uncertain how this name is supposed to be pronounced. Checking my usual source, you see Nabob, while the name itself is apparently an alternate spelling of a Mughal Nawab, which would lead me towards Nabob being the closer pronunciation. Regardless of which one it is, let's move on. We'll start, as usual, with when the ship was laid down. In this case, not in a British shipyard. In common with a lot of British escort carriers, Nabob began her life in the United States. The ship was laid down in Seattle on October 20th, 1942, as an American Bogue-class escort carrier, or in British service, the Attacker and Ruler class, depending on which group you're looking at. The first group of converted merchants were the Attacker class. The second group, built from the keel up as carriers, were the Rulers. Nabob falls into the second group, although you'll see sources cite the ship beginning life as a merchantman, so make of that what you will. Either way, these ships displaced between 11 to 12,000 tons on a length of 492 feet or 150 meters, with a beam of 69 feet or 21 meters. Not exactly large by aircraft carrier standards, but they didn't really need to be. For escorting convoys or ferrying aircraft, this was plenty large enough, especially because these ships could carry around 24 aircraft, which was more than enough for hunting down U-boats. Generally speaking, this air wing would consist primarily of Grumman Wildcats, in the form of the General Motors produced FM model, or in British service, also known as the Martlet. Heavier striking power would come from Grumman TBM Avengers. That was the offensive punch of the Ruler class. For defensive purposes, this could vary between ships. Generally speaking, it consisted of two 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, with 8 twin 40mm Bofors mounts for 16 barrels in all, supported in turn by 20 20mm cannon in single mountings. With all of this equipment pushed through the water at 17 knots on 9,350 shaft horsepower, through one shaft, reflecting the ship's merchant origin. And with that wrapping up this section, we can return to Nabob's service. As I said, the ship was laid down in Seattle on October 20th, 1942. She would be launched on March 22nd, 1943, under the name Edisto, not USS Edisto, because the ship wasn't commissioned into the United States Navy. She was sold to the British during her fitting out stage, being transferred on September 7th, 1943, and commissioned as HMS Nabob. Even this wasn't as simple as it seems, because the ship wasn't actually crewed by the Royal Navy as it would turn out. You see, the Canadians were quite eager to gain experience in operating aircraft carriers. They would have liked to have Nabob for practice in this regard. However, under the terms of Lend-Lease, it wasn't quite so simple. No one but the Royal Navy could legally operate the ship. As a result, Nabob would be under Royal Navy control and remain HMS Nabob. But, for all intents and purposes, the ship was really HMCS Nabob. Royal Navy control aside, the ship was manned by the Canadians. Aside from the air wing, which was from the Royal Navy, yet according to Hobbs, mostly made up of New Zealanders, because things aboard this ship weren't complicated enough. In any event, the new carrier sailed from Seattle to Vancouver after the transfer. As she was initially built for American service, the ship needed some modifications to be brought to British standard. This would begin on November 1st, 1943, and last until January 12th, 1944. Importantly, that means the ship's active service would turn out to be less than a year long. And it didn't exactly have a promising start either. On January 25th, 1944, the new carrier proceeded to run aground, with at least one source citing it being just under top speed. The carrier had been training at the time, including flight operations. The same source cites the ship hitting an uncharted sandbar while turning into the wind to recover aircraft. There were 2 attempts made that first day to pull the ship free. Unfortunately, despite lightening the carrier and running her own engines, both attempts failed. It would ultimately take 3 days to refloat the unfortunate ship on January 28, 1944. On the plus side, though, no major damage was done. After a short checkover, Nabob was able to set sail again on February 8th. This would see the ship transit the Panama Canal in March. She arrived specifically on March 1st, transiting the canal the same day to arrive in Norfolk on March 8th. Not without incident, mind you. Apparently, there were issues between the various crew aboard the ship, which ranged from the Canadians to the British and New Zealander pilots to British Merchant Navy men running the engine room. Each group had different rates of pay. Exactly how this became an issue does vary on source. I've seen it attributed to the Canadians complaining about poor food and allowances outside their Royal Canadian Navy pay. By contrast, I've also seen it be attributed to the British personnel complaining about poor food again and not being paid as much as the Canadians. Either way, this would result in some of the Canadian crew deserting the ship in Norfolk until the situation was sorted out, by the ship's captain flying up to Ottawa in person to argue for his crew. This resulted in the ship receiving Canadian levels of pay and food across the board, which evidently solved the issue. Once that issue was sorted out and the ship finished a short refit, Nabob set sail once more. She departed for New York on March 18, 1944, where the carrier picked up a load of aircraft to carry on to Britain, departing with those aboard on March 23rd. She would arrive in Britain on April 7th for yet another refit. This would last until the end of June, with the ship training until the end of July. As a result, Nabob would only see proper combat in August 1944, with the first bit taking place on August 10th or August 9th, depending on the source, when Nabob joined other ships in mine-laying operations off Norway. This saw the carrier's aircraft lay mines but also attacked German land positions, destroying and damaging aircraft, land facilities, and merchant shipping. Overall, a successful first operation. Unfortunately, it would be her only successful operation. HMS Nabob was assigned to Operation Goodwood on August 18, 1944, a series of air raids on the battleship Tirpitz and her Norwegian home. For Nabob, only the first raid is relevant. Poor weather saw this delayed. The carriers arrived off Norway on August 20th, but the ships had to wait for the weather to clear. As a result, the first attack came on August 22nd. Even then, however, Nabob couldn't contribute. The weather was still poor enough that only the fleet carriers contributed aircraft, which is doubly unfortunate for one reason. At 5:15 p.m. on the same day, August 22nd, 1944, HMS Nabob was torpedoed. A single acoustic weapon, fired by U-354, hit the carrier's stern. This opened up a 32-square-foot hole near the engine room, causing severe and rapid flooding. Within a few minutes, the ship was listing to starboard, and more critically, down 15 feet by the stern. 38 of the crew were lost, and the carrier's prop shaft was bent. This was bad enough, but it could have been much worse. The U-boat fired a second torpedo to try and finish the job, but this hit HMS Bickerton instead. That ship would have to be scuttled as a result. As for Nabob, the crew managed to get the flooding under control. 210 of them were taken off to be safe, but the remainder kept their ship afloat. They were even able to get a couple Avengers into the air to deter further submarine attack. Admittedly, one of those crashed upon landing, but it's still an impressive feat. Meanwhile, Nabob was able to get underway at around 10 knots after careful repair work, and slowly working up from 3 to 5 and finally 10 knots. This would allow the carrier to reach Scapa Flow 5 days later under her own power. Sadly, this is where her story as an active warship came to an end. Nabob remained afloat, but the damage was too extensive for economical repair, so the ship was beached and abandoned on September 30th, 1944, and promptly cannibalized for spare parts for her sister ships. Despite this, however, the ship remained in one piece, so Nabob would eventually be refloated in 1946 and returned to the United States on March 16, 1946. This would not see her return to service, with Nabob sold off on October 26th of the same year. Initially, she was due for scrapping in September of 1947. However, instead, the ship would be converted into a merchant still under the name Nabob in 1951. She would serve under this name until 1967, at which point she was renamed to Glory, with the ship finally leaving service in the late 1970s. Glory, the ex-Nabob, was scrapped in Taiwan at the end of 1977, a surprisingly long life for a ship that came so close to sinking. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.